So, first of all, my name is Magnus Svanstorp. I'm from the Swedish Defence University. And first of all, welcome to the Swedish Defence University, also for those who are following us on social media. This is live broadcast. But especially to Jacob Ware, who has Swedish roots, but who has also written the best-selling book, God, Guns, and Sedition, Far-Right Terrorism in America, together with my former boss, Bruce Hoffman, that is published by Columbia University Press. We're delighted that you're here to enrich our knowledge about this complex phenomena, and also very topical phenomena given the election coming up this autumn. Jacob Ware is a research fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service. The book, God, Guns, and Sedition, here, is an in-depth study of far-right violent extremism in the United States. And I recommend all of you to take a look at it and to delve into it. It is an in-depth study of far-right violent extremism in the United States. It traces the historical trajectory and provide portraits of the leaders behind the violence in the US and their followers. Hoffman and Ware also highlight key terrorist tactics, how they use communication technology, the embrace of leaderless resistance. Lone actor terrorism originates from this period, the US. Infiltration and recruitment in the military that we have seen, and also law enforcement. And of course, the movements, the right-wing movements, intricate relationship with mainstream politics. And one of my favorite authors is Lawrence Wright. And when he wrote the review of the book, he wrote the following. I think it sort of captures the quality of the work that Hoffman and Ware have done. And he says, both have produced a revealing history of America's almost uninterrupted experience with domestic terrorism, from the Ku Klux Klan to the January 6th assault on the Capitol. This is an essential volume for understanding the dark side of the American dream, and comes with an urgent call to reverse the drift towards violence and disunity. And we're delighted that we have Jacob here to unpack some of these complexities and the different strands that we're seeing in relation to far-right extremism in the United States. So I'll welcome you up on stage, and you will give a lecture now for about 45 minutes, and then I'll ask you a few questions, and then we'll open up for a Q&A. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I do wish the book was a bestseller. I'm not sure it is, but we just have to keep working harder. In the academic sense, perhaps. Okej, min mamma är svensk, men tyvärr slutade jag på svenskskolan när jag var 9 år gammal. Så jag brukar skoja att om ni vill höra ett föredrag om terrorism på svenska från en 9-åring så kan jag faktiskt göra det. But this is a serious subject matter, so I do want to make sure we take it seriously. So yes, I'm over here kind of on a little book swing through Stockholm and Norway, trying to spread the word about our book, as well as the issues it covers, and some of the concerns that we have over the next little period here. So what I thought I would do today is open up with some background and some context historically, dive down into some of the themes that we pull out of the book, some of which Magnus has already previewed, and then look at a particular case study, which is the US presidential election in November, which is causing a lot of concern, I can say, in the domestic counterterrorism community back home in Washington, D.C., where I'm coming to you from. So let me start off by taking you to the moment where Bruce and I sat down together and realized we thought there was a book here, and that is March 2020, the start of the COVID pandemic. I remember very well Bruce, my co-author, Bruce Hoffman, coming to me and saying, you know, It's remarkable how when a new stimulus emerges, a new scary moment, a new moment in international relations, political science, it's quite stunning how some of the age-old tropes that we've seen in this space for decades, even centuries, can just kind of spiral up again in a new environment. On the left-hand side here, these are just some kind of assorted pieces of far-right propaganda that we pulled off of. I think these came from Telegram, which is a social media site. On the far left, you kind of see the racist, anti-immigrant conspiracy theories that came up. On the right, of course, you see that Trojan horse anti-Semitic argument, the idea that something like COVID emerges as a Trojan horse to advance Jewish interests in Western societies. There was a lot of coverage at the time of these conspiracy theories, these ideas that were emerging. Professor Hoffman, Bruce, and I, based on our prior work, we felt that this was actually part of a longer trajectory. So that's what we sought to do. Now, let me briefly explain our book title, God, Guns, and Sedition, because it's three words that are connected, and this is somewhat serendipitous, but they do relate somewhat to the major eras of the movement. So our book begins, the narrative of our book begins in 1978, because something very important happens that year. Now, it's important to note, of course, that's not the start of far-right violent extremism in the US context. It's definitely not the start of white supremacy in the US context. Our country was founded on ideals of white supremacy. We fought a civil war over it. But in 1978, there is the publication of a book which would prove to be very important in a lot of ideological and strategic, so violent strategic ideas that the movement was working on. That book was called The Turner Diaries. Estimates say that book has inspired thousands of murders over the course of the past 50 years. But it really kind of catalyzes an ideological and strategic rebirth for the movement. When you look at the movement in the 1970s and 80s, there is a significant religious element to it. Leaders of the movement often preface their names with terms like reverend or pastor. And leading groups often emerged out of churches. So, for example, you had the Church of Jesus Christ Christian, which is a Christian identity church, which grew out of the Ku Klux Klan and eventually led to the formation of a group called the Aryan Nations, which sought to basically create a breakaway white supremacist state in the Pacific Northwest. So they were in Idaho, but they were trying to break off, I think, Washington State, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, and Oregon, I believe, those five. This is their logo, right? This is the Aryan Nations logo. And I'll just read an excerpt from an Aryan Nations brochure from the 1980s, just to kind of emphasize what a significant religious element there was here. So in this brochure, they write, "We believe that there is a battle being fought this day between the children of darkness, today known as Jews, and the children of light, God, the Aryan race, the true Israel of the Bible. We believe in the preservation of our race, individually and collectively, as a people as demanded and directed by God. We believe a racial nation has a right and is under obligation to preserve itself and its members. As his divine race, we have been commissioned to fulfill his divine purpose and plans." So you should be able to see this is nothing less than divinely ordained white supremacy, right? White supremacy couched in religious language that leads to groups like the Aryan Nations. The modern far right is then catapulted, I would argue, by two quite well-known incidents that occur in the early 1990s. Those are Ruby Ridge in 1992 and the Waco siege in 1993. So at the first of those events, you have an FBI-led standoff that results in the deaths of the wife and son of an alleged Aryan Nations member, so that previous group, in rural Idaho, near where that group was based. In the latter event, 82 members of the Branch Davidians religious group were killed after the FBI and Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms led a siege on the Davidian compound in Waco, Texas, prominently profiled in a number of documentaries at this point, as well as dramatized in Netflix series. Soon after these events, anti-government hysteria was further compounded by the Clinton administration's 1994 passage of the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act, also known as the Brady Bill, which places background checks on certain firearm purchases. Those three events are essential. Ruby Ridge, Waco, and Brady Bill provide a toxic mix of some of the things that right-wing, far-right extremists love the most: guns, religion, and a compound standing in the face of federal agents. These directly lead to the most lethal domestic terrorist attack in US history, which occurs on April 19th, 1995, when the individual in the picture on the left here, a Gulf War veteran and gun fanatic called Timothy McVeigh, detonates a truck bomb under the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Office Building in Oklahoma City, killing 168 people. He explicitly justified his act as revenge for Ruby Ridge and Waco. You won't be able to see this in the picture, but I just want to point, this picture is actually taken outside the Waco siege, so you can already see that connection. Those bumper stickers on the front, I'll point to the front two ones there. The one on the far right says, "Ban guns, make the streets safe for a government takeover." The one on to the left of that says, "Fear the government that fears your guns." This is the cover of the Turner Diaries. It's written by an individual called William Luther Pierce, who leads a neo-Nazi group called the National Alliance. He's writing it under a pseudonym called Andrew MacDonald. And for as long as that book was in print, which was actually up to around January 6th, you could get it on Amazon, the back cover of this book has, in large letters, "What will you do when they come to take your guns?" So firearms and the mythology that firearms have in a US context are absolutely essential to this story. A year later, in July 1996, Eric Rudolph, an anti-abortion extremist, detonates a bomb at the Olympic Park in Atlanta, Georgia, killing an individual. And these two events in combination really lead to a quite substantial crackdown on the violent far right in America. And they go away for a while. The movement is reawakened in 2008. 2008 is a central year for the violent far right in America for three reasons. One of those should be pretty obvious. In America, we elect our first black president. So a huge ideological boost for the violent far right. Social media comes to the fore as kind of being a major player on the political scene, and we have an economic crisis. So those three things together lead to a big spike in activism and organization in the violent far right. And from then until now, really, we've seen a string of both white supremacist and anti-government activity. On the white supremacist side, we've seen a deadly trajectory that runs through Oslo, of course, Charleston, South Carolina, Oak Creek, Wisconsin, Trollhättan, near where my family is from, Charlottesville, Virginia, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Christchurch, New Zealand, Poway, California, El Paso, Texas, Buffalo, New York, Jacksonville, Florida, other places, of course. We have also seen anti-government violence, as we saw at January 6th. Now, the word sedition is an English language word that basically means intent to overthrow the government. And we use that word very deliberately, not without controversy. The reason it's deliberate is because seditious conspiracy, arguably the most serious criminal charge in the United States. So again, intent, conspiracy to overthrow the United States government, was successfully used against leaders of groups who organized January 6th. So the leaders of groups that you might have heard of, like the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, were found guilty and prosecuted and sentenced on seditious conspiracy charges, which to us, to Bruce and I, means that the government successfully proved that what happened on January 6th was organized intent to overthrow the government. And that's why we feel we can use that word sedition comfortably. The themes. So we're getting down into the tactical level now. I know there's a lot on this screen, and I'm going to run through this pretty quickly. So this is a good basis. I think if you have any questions on any of this stuff, I'm happy to dive down deeper. I did also mention to Magnus beforehand, I'm happy to take questions in Swedish, although I probably won't answer in Swedish because I'm so insecure. But here are the themes. So if I had to tell you, what is the characteristic or what is the manifestation of violent far-right extremism in the United States and abroad today, I would answer it like this, basically. Right? This is the story. So as the threat manifests in the United States, as it manifests here in Sweden, elsewhere in Europe, this is what it looks like, basically. I'm going to argue that the first four are somewhat connected. They're also connected to number 8, so they all basically have the same genesis. 5, 6, 7 are really significant in the United States, and I'll go over those quickly. So the most important theme by far, again, Magnus previewed it, is communications. Now, Bruce is very fond of saying that the two most significant developments for terrorists in the 21st century are social media radicalization and lone actor violence. And in the terrorism studies space, I think we sometimes fall into this complacency or misunderstanding in thinking that both of those ideologies, or both of those, themes, both of those developments were developed by the Islamic State like a decade ago, as they kind of blitzkrieg through the Levant and then inspired attacks in the West. We find that actually the violent far right was talking about those things as early as the 1970s and 80s. So the violent far right pioneered internet technology in 1983, I think, with the Aryan Nations Liberty Net. Every time we've had new communications technology, whether it's the internet forums, social media, live streams, the violent far right has found ways to manipulate that technology for their violent goals. That matters especially right now, right? Because we're kind of cresting over the precipice of a new generation in communications technology with generative AI and deepfakes. And if history is going to be a guide, the violent far right is going to be the community, the movement that really shows us how extremists are going to be using those technologies. So take note of that. Related to that is that shift towards lone actor violence. So in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, the violence that we saw from this movement and others was often categorized by groups or small cells launching relatively complex attacks, usually at what we in the studies or in the military call hard targets. So a hard target is a complex site, well defended. Things like government buildings, military installations, defense universities. We've seen a shift from the violent far right especially. So they've moved from groups to individuals. So now we largely see those individualized attacks. With that, we've seen a shift away from complex attacks. So let's take, for example, the Oklahoma City bombing. All right, small cell conducting a very complex attack at a relatively hard target. We don't really see a lot of bombings anymore. These days, we largely see rudimentary or cruder weaponry. So in the US, that's firearm attacks. In Europe, it's mostly been stabbing attacks, or what we might call melee attacks, van rammings. We've also seen a shift from hard targets to soft targets. So not really government buildings anymore, not really military sites, but places of worship, schools, supermarkets. We can look at the Buffalo shooting, for example, that happened in May 2022, just about 2 years ago. 10 people were killed at a supermarket there by a lone actor who live streamed his attack. He's kind of the archetypal 21st century terrorist. And I actually think, I was thinking about this when I was in Oslo for the past 2 weeks. I actually think the attack that happened there on July 22nd, 2011 is almost the bridge, because he has both of those things, right? He has that complex, explosive attack at a hard target. And you kind of saw, it was effective, but he didn't have that kind of high death toll that Timothy McVeigh did. But then he did have the high death toll when he went to the soft target and he used the firearm, the more easily accessible weapon, if you like. So he kind of showed that you can do a lot of damage without having to put those very complex, very dangerous plots together. So we've seen that shift over the past 10 to 15 years. The third theme is, I would argue, by far the most difficult one to talk about, by far the most difficult one to come to, the realization of, and that is the rise in what you might call personal vulnerabilities or susceptibilities or grievances over the past 10 to 15 years in the terrorism space. What do I mean by that? Things like youth, things like mental health issues, primarily autism spectrum disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and suicidal depression. Things like histories of loneliness, isolation, and bullying, violence in the home, histories of parental or partner suicide, substance abuse. All of those things, romantic frustrations, all of those things are coming up again and again and again in the data set over the past 10 to 15 years. I'll point to a group that I've done a lot of research on in the US context as being a case study. I don't know if anybody's heard of a neo-Nazi group called the Atomwaffen Division, which was active in the US context, 2016, 2017. Obviously, that's German translation to Nuclear Weapons Division. That group was responsible for 5 murders across 3 states in its kind of heyday, 2 in Virginia, 2 in Florida, 1 in California. When you look at those individuals, those 3 killers, those 3 terrorists, whatever word you want to use, as well as the founder of that group, Brandon Russell, all 4 of those individuals were under the age of 22. All 4 of those individuals have autism spectrum disorder and 1 other mental health issue. So this is a prominent neo-Nazi group in the US context, providing a real threat to American communities where mental illness and youth are playing a, I would argue, driving role, right? And that is a really difficult conclusion to come to from a counterterrorism standpoint, where we want to think these things are purely ideological as opposed to perhaps personal. Related to that is that number 4, convergence. So the term I really want us to focus on here is great replacement. I would argue, it might not be the case here in Europe, where obviously there's a threat from the East and there's a land war in Europe. But in the US, I would argue that great replacement theory is the biggest threat to national security. This conspiracy theory basically says that there is an ongoing replacement happening of Western, white, Christian masculinity, operationalized through immigration, right, minority political rights, LGBTQ plus rights. But crucially, that's not accidental, it's deliberate, right? It's organized by Jews, by liberals, by what Anders Breivik called cultural Marxists. That's really dangerous, and all the violence that we've seen basically over the past 10 to 15 years is directly linked to that ideology. Because part of what makes it so dangerous is it's really big tent. What I mean by that is there's lots of, you can basically derive any enemy under that, whether it's a minority group, a religious group, a group of left-wing activists. Any group can come under that category. Convergence just means mixing and matching of ideologies. So that's one thing we've seen across the spectrum recently. People taking different traditions, whether it's traditional white supremacy or misogynistic extremism or kind of left-wing ecological concerns, mixing them all together to create a new ideology. All 4 of those first 4 things, I think, all come from social media, where social media has allowed radical ideologies to project directly into a living room or a bedroom. Somebody with a personal grievance can pick that up, can answer for your own issues, but you can do it in a way that kind of what the FBI calls a salad bar. So you're picking pieces that answer for those grievances as opposed to kind of an age-old ideology, and then you're acting alone, and because you're acting alone, you're targeting a soft target using more easily accessible weaponry. So all 4 of those things are related. Briefly, number 5, US military emerges as a huge theme in our book. It's really quite troubling reading through to see how many of the individuals in our story are veterans of the US military. We also find extremist groups are trying to infiltrate the military, seeking tactics, training expertise, insurgency, counterinsurgency training. It's really an ongoing theme. Particularly, we see spikes after US military wars, basically. So, in fact, after every single conflict the US military has ever fought, we've seen a spike in far-right extremism. So that includes the Civil War, World War I, World War II, Korea and Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq and Afghanistan. There is always a spike in far-right activity among people who come home. We can speculate later on about why that might be. 6 is the legal challenges that we have in the United States. Long story short, we have international terrorism statutes in the US, we do not have a domestic terrorism statute. So when you read through the book, you're going to come across a lot of violent incidents in the US perpetrated by far-right extremists. None of them have a terrorism charge. None of them are recognized in the legal system, in the federal legal system, as a terrorist. That leads to issues with optics, of course, because we're prosecuting people of a different religion and usually a different race as terrorists, even for non-violent crimes. We're not prosecuting white people conducting violent crimes as terrorists. So you have the optics issue, but even more tangibly, you have a sentencing equity and then recidivism issue. So people who reoffend because they didn't spend enough time in prison. Number 7, briefly, again, there is an interaction with mainstream politics. When you look past at the previous 3 new presidents we've had in the US, Presidents Obama, Trump, and Biden, each of those 3 individuals had considerable impacts on the violent far right. So considerable kind of spikes in activity after their elections and during their administrations. I'm going to park that for now because we're going to get to that in just a minute. Number 8, again, relates, I think, to that social media side, is the blurring between domestic and international in ways that are very, I think, upsetting for law enforcement agencies, because law enforcement agencies like to have everything in buckets, right? They like to say, okay, these are the homegrown cases, these are domestic, these are international. That's not really the case anymore, right? These ideologies and also these groups are starting to span across oceans, let alone across borders. And that makes kind of a traditional conceptualization of domestic terrorism very difficult to get at. Moreover, the US is a real node in this space, right? US ideologies and US groups are exporting their ideas and exporting their tactics abroad. And again, we're going to get to that in a minute, so I'll park that just for now. Again, happy to talk about any of these in Q&A if you want to dive down into any of them. Really briefly, our final chapter is our recommendations chapter. It's the longest one. Bruce and I work for a foreign policy organization in DC, so we had to have recommendations. We broke them into short, medium, and long term. So short term is really the regulatory framework. So things we could do today to strengthen some of the legal measures that we have. That includes domestic terrorism legislation, as I kind of previewed, includes legislation on social media, includes legislation on gun control. Medium-term measures that you would implement now that would hopefully have an impact in 5 to 10 years. That's really civil society. So some of you might have heard of things like countering violent extremism programming or prevention programming, things to deal with mental health issues or youth in this space. How do you build up resiliency? One thing a lot of people in the US are talking about right now is something called digital literacy programming, which is the concept of there's such a flood of extremist material online, you're never going to be able to kind of turn off that tap. So can you train people to be able to spot bad information for themselves? So there's a whole industry growing in the US right now with digital literacy, training people to be able to identify mis and disinformation on their own. And then long-term measures which seek to build some kind of unity in the United States. The most depressing thing about writing this book was when we first started writing it, when we first came up with our first draft, we actually started off our recommendations chapter with a message on unity, saying if you ever want to make progress on the domestic terrorism issue, you have to start with trust and faith in the system, in government, in media, in each other, in your neighbors, in your family members. And basically everything else can flow from that kind of stronger civil society. And the peer reviewers and the people in our organization who read the book basically said to us, listen, you can't start off your recommendation section like that because you know it's not realistic. You know it's just not going to happen. That's a really scary thought. So we do kind of at this point concede that this is going to be a 30, 40, a generational struggle to kind of rebuild some of that trust, some of those social bonds in our country. That's one of the reasons why people in the US are very concerned about election violence. So I just mentioned that the previous 3 new administrations all led to rises in extremism. I've done other studies back home where I look at elections specifically, and usually we see violence during election seasons. That is actually kind of an American tradition. We know about January 6th, right? That's not unfamiliar to you. The incident in 2022 was a assassination attempt on our Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, at her home in San Francisco, where her husband was badly beaten. That was a couple of days before the midterms in 2022. The Speaker of the House is third in line to the presidency in the US. I think it's third in line. Leader of our lower chamber. I had written about election violence in 2022, warning about it, and afterwards I got a lot of calls from the media saying, why did we not see more violence? And I said, you do realize, right, that we had an assassination attempt on the third in line to the US presidency. Like, that's the level of violence that we've accepted as being normal in the US. That's the kind of scale that we're dealing with here. Now, I wrote another report for my organization, CFR, in April I think it was called Preventing US Election Violence in 2024, where I concluded that there is a serious risk of election violence in our country this year. The report goes into some depth on possible scenarios, what the accelerating factors are, some of the mitigating circumstances, and then, of course, makes recommendations. It's quite detailed, so I thought today I would just kind of zoom out and talk about some of the bigger buckets, some of the bigger reasons, more strategic reasons why we're concerned on this issue. And the first, most serious problem that we're facing is political rhetoric. So there's two sides to this, right? The first is kind of on the left-hand side. You have these warnings or promises or predictions of violence. One of the most important moments in our book, I would argue, is, you might remember it, the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally in August 2017. At Charlottesville, you had a group of explicit neo-Nazis and white supremacists who gathered in that city, a college town in my home state, for an explicitly white supremacist cause, right, the removal of the Confederate statue. And they protested that, and then a terrorist attack occurred at that location. Somebody drove his car into a group of counter-protesters. And afterwards, you had this horrible, very public, very ugly back and forth in the media, where the media kept trying to get then President Trump to condemn the violence. And he kind of wouldn't do it and couldn't bring himself to do it because he felt that the individuals were supporters of him. It ended with 6 words that have proven to be immortal in the US domestic terrorism space. Quote, very fine people on both sides. We know from our study that people point to that, violent extremists in the US point to that as being the moment where they felt they had protection from the White House. So when you have individuals, prominent politicians, warning of riots in the streets depending on court cases, bedlam, just a few weeks ago President Trump said there'd be a bloodbath. Every time this happens, we have this back and forth in the media. Do they mean it? Do they not? What are they doing? And we know from our studies that people within the movement are kind of taking those cues like dog whistles and saying, okay, I understand. If we lose the election, there can be a bloodbath. So you have the warnings and the promises of violence. On the other side of that, though, you have almost an eroding of a taboo against violence. So for some context here, January 6th is the largest investigation in FBI history. There were 1,000 arrests. I'm not sure if they've reached 1,000 successful prosecutions yet. I don't think so because a lot of people pled guilty. But largest investigation in FBI history. And again, they successfully proved seditious conspiracy charges against some of those individuals. So again, they proved intent to overthrow the government. Now, 3 years later, this is on January 26th, you have prominent politicians on the right who are using terms like hostages, political prisoners, martyrs to describe the people who are serving federal prison sentences for crimes committed on January 6th. So there's almost a message being sent that if you do it again, we will protect you. I mean, if President Trump is elected president, they will pardon the individuals and release them from prison. So you're undermining, you're both, on the left-hand side, you're kind of sowing the seeds for violence. On the right-hand side, you're undermining deterrence. So you have that kind of both-sided political rhetoric that's leading towards that conclusion. However, this relates more to the kind of violence that we saw on January 6th, which mercifully was relatively non-lethal, relatively. But I worry more about a different form of violence in 2024, and that is great replacement theory-inspired violence. So the biggest issue in our election this year, the biggest topic is immigration reform and border security. It's the most divisive issue, the one that everybody's trying to run on. I know there's a lot on this slide. Please don't read it all. I just want you to focus a little bit on the yellow words here. The two pictures on top here are extracts from a manifesto written by a terrorist who killed 23 people at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas in August 2019. El Paso is a border city, and he had driven from a place called Allen, Texas, about 10 hours to travel to El Paso because he knew this Walmart would be full of immigrants, Latino immigrants, and he opened fire and he killed 23 people at that location. The bottom two pictures are pictures that I took screenshots off Twitter. Tucker Carlson and Elon Musk, two kind of prominent right-wing political media figures in our country. I'm just pointing out here the similarity in some of this language. So on the right-hand side, you have certain phrases here that just are not that common. Like the term one-party state is not that common in the US. Nobody really uses that language. The word illegals, I mean, you have that word on the right, but rarely. There is like a mimicking of language here from political figures, from media figures on the right, and actual terrorists. The one on the left actually concerns me more because it uses the word invasion, which is a word that we use freely now to talk about immigrants in the US. Invasion is a military term, right? Invasions are violent. And the only way anybody's ever successfully defended a nation against an invasion is through violence. So when Tucker Carlson tweets to 13 million people, where are the men of Texas? Why aren't they protecting their state? I would answer him, well, because when they protect their state, they do protect their state, first of all. And when they do, it looks like the carnage we saw at that Walmart. So the language that's being used to speak of immigrants is dehumanizing at best, irresponsible at best, outright incitement to violence at worst. There's another layer here too. Trump recently used the term that there was a lot of concern over in the US because it was pretty fascist, pretty Nazi. He said immigrants are poisoning the blood of our country, right? Which people in the Washington Post pointed out comes straight from Mein Kampf. So I would argue if he wins the election, there's going to be a sense of empowerment against immigrants. If he loses the election, you should be able to see on the right-hand side here, they are laying the groundwork to say the election was stolen because of immigrants, because a bunch of illegals came in, were legalized, and now we're creating one-party state. So if the Trump campaign loses the election, I would argue there's groundwork being laid for a violent reaction against immigrant communities in the United States. So that's the second reason, political rhetoric and anti-immigrant extremism. The third issue is kind of a new one. I mean, terrorism scholars have been concerned about AI and deepfakes for a while, but I would argue that, well, they have arrived now, and we've all been kind of caught sleeping at the wheel. We've already seen this have an impact on voting. So this case comes from New Hampshire. It was actually quite a strange case because this was a left-wing rival to President Trump in the primary who released this deepfake audio to say basically, don't vote in a New Hampshire primary because if you want to beat President Trump, you have to vote in November. President Biden saying that on an audio call. It was fake, and I don't think very effective, but certainly a concern. I think just yesterday or just 2 days ago, our Department of Homeland Security back home released a report warning of AI in the election, and this was one of the case studies they used to say this is the kind of thing they're expecting. Fundamentally, AI and radicalization, I think, is going to be an issue of speed and scale. So I would be surprised if they find ways to reinvent completely what they're doing. It's going to be more about greater speed of radical information, greater scale of radicalization, both for radicalization recruitment, but also disinformation. One of the things that I worry about a lot is, you know, the biggest problem that the Trump campaign had in 2020 when they began, and since, when they began to claim that the election or electoral fraud will exist this time because it will be created. The real threat, though, is what is called the liar's dividend, which is this concept that as you start to flood the zone with more disinformation, more fake content, the real impact is actually that everything becomes fake. Nothing can be trusted anymore. And so we're basically sleepwalking into a information wasteland unless social media companies take this more seriously. And that, needless to say, is going to be quite a boon for extremist groups. Number 4, so counterterrorism practitioners typically measure threats, or criminologists measure threats as a factor of 3 things: intent, capability, and opportunity. Intent, capability, opportunity. So the first thing, intent, I mean, I would argue, I think, with some evidence that intent to violence has risen in the US. That's why Bruce and I were able to write 448 pages about this movement. Capability in the US is always high. That's the reality of our gun climate. The thing that is different this time is the volume of opportunity. I've argued elsewhere that I think we were actually pretty lucky on January 6th, because by the time the election was called on November 7th, people who were inclined to violence on that side of the spectrum actually had relatively little time to prepare something. That's not the case this time, because there's much more of a preventive posture being put out. We have campaigning, we have primary voting, although that's largely passed. We have political conventions, mail-in voting, early voting, election day voting, vote tallying, ceremonial dates like January 6th, and Inauguration Day. All of those are opportunities for violence. This is an extract from a Washington Post article talking about Trump's federal court case in DC, and I just use this as a brief kind of example to say, this is the level of security they're concerned about for one court case in one city at one moment in time. Think about all the vulnerabilities we're going to have throughout the country, all the opportunities for violence throughout the next 8 months. The court cases are the big X factor here. These have inspired violence already, specifically against law enforcement in various places, Cincinnati being the most prominent case. As he wins, as he loses these court cases, it's going to have impact on how the movement sees the 2024 cycle. The most important thing here, though, with the volume of opportunity is, I'll borrow an international relations term, is the security dilemma that we're facing in this space. Security dilemma is a realist term that says basically anything you do to prepare to boost your own security will be met with, will be interpreted as an offensive maneuver. The biggest challenge I was having when I was writing my report in April was trying to think about things that the Biden administration, which obviously has no legitimacy on the political right, could do to prepare defenses or educate the public about electoral integrity or to prevent or deter violence. And basically, I could think of nothing, frankly. There is basically nothing that the Biden administration could do today to prepare for violence in 2024 that would not itself be seen as preparation for further fraud. So again, we're kind of sleepwalking into a situation where you're basically unable to respond preemptively. My last thought is it's really important that people in Sweden, in Oslo, where I just was for 2 weeks, in Europe, in South America, basically everywhere, don't fall into a sense of complacency and think, the things that happen in the US are unique to the United States. They don't pose a national security threat to us. They don't pose a foreign policy concern. There are over 80 elections in the world this year. Should the United States lead the way in dysfunction and violence, I would argue there will be a contagion out of the United States. Authoritarian movements elsewhere will take that cue, and they will think they have permission to do the same thing. Our book, the narrative of our book, I believe, ends on January 3rd, 2023. That's the release of the January 6th congressional report in the US. On January 8th, there was an election riot in Brazil, right, with a very similar mob organized by mobilized by similar grievances, similar organization, similar target, very similar leader. By the way, that leader was in self-proclaimed exile in Florida. And notably, Brazil is a country that's part of BRICS, which is the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa Union. So a battlefront in great power competition that we are providing a model for how they can try to steal their elections. So it's really important that people outside the US are kind of watching what we're doing, learning from our mistakes, and trying to build up their own democratic resilience so that these kind of forces cannot undermine democracies and electoral processes. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to take any questions in Q&A.
All right, thank you. I think if you want to sit down for all the questions that may come.
Wonderful.
Thank you for being so optimistic about the future. Let me start by just asking a question I always wondered, and that is, I remember Oklahoma City. I used to spend summers in Oklahoma, and then, of course, this came out of nowhere, this whole attack in 1995 by Timothy McVeigh and this whole militia movement, the KKK, the Christian identity movement, etc. But the U.S., particularly after 9/11, they did not really focus so much on the right wing, the far right problems, etc. And that probably, is a mistake, given what is happening now. But what's the size and scope of these different groups? I know it's a difficult question. We talk about Proud Boys, we talk about Oath Keepers. I would think the FBI now have a pretty good handle on who are the movers and shakers in these. But you have also KKK, you have other groups, you have the militias, etc. How big are they, and where are the sort of main epicenters of this?
Sure. So I'll answer that a few different ways. In terms of the groups, they tend to be relatively small, at least the prominent white supremacist groups. So Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, the KKK certainly, they're not big. And they are, frankly, they're probably all infiltrated. So that's a relatively minor threat numerically. The militia movement, which is kind of quite widespread across the American frontier, is bigger. Cynthia Miller-Idris, who's a prominent scholar of the far right, I think she says they're in the tens of thousands. That's the most usual estimation, is 5 figures. But other movements are enormous. So QAnon, for example, QAnon is a movement of millions of people, and it's not necessarily a violent movement, but certainly it's pretty, what's the word? They believe that the Democratic Party is overrun with Satan-worshipping, child sex trafficking pedophiles, so it's not necessarily a movement that can exist in a democracy. So there's millions of people there. And one of the things that's really concerning and kind of numerically is the groups. I argue groups don't matter that much. What matters is the network and the movement. What matters is the momentum. And there's been some polling coming out in the last year in the US where polling places have asked some variant of the question: can violence ever be justified in defense of your political views or in defense of your country, however that's defined? And the number of people who say yes is usually about 33%, 40% on the right, about 20% on the left. Again, those numbers are astronomical. They are completely antithetical to liberal democracy, because people are saying, basically they're saying, if my views don't win out, if my ideals, if my idea of a country doesn't triumph against these other seditious forces, these other dangerous forces in our country, then 33% say they have legitimacy to use violence. I think, to borrow IR language again, I think that the social contract basically says that you give up your right to violence in order to be protected by the state as part of the country. So the social contract is freeing. And that, I think, regardless of how big the groups are or the movement is, that's that thing that is really hard to combat.
Yeah. Now, what do you see as the largest challenge in relation to whether Trump get into office, for example? If he doesn't get into office, you were talking a little bit about this. What would happen after Trump? If Trump one day he will pass the scene. And he's such a galvanizing force, taking directives and directions and so on. And people around him also are maybe not as charismatic or can give direction. So is it a very fragmented movement, or is the pivot really Trump in relation to giving inspiration and giving energy and mobilizing force, etc.?
It's a really good question, and it's one that a lot of people try to approach in the US. I mean, it's not necessarily one that I'm an expert on because I tend to focus on violence, but I'll give it a go in terms of how people are thinking about it in the US. I mean, he is very charismatic and he is the pivot point. And one thing he's done better than anything, his great accomplishment is there has been a purge of the party. Anybody who kind of served in what President Trump called deep state during his campaign, anybody in Congress who pushed back, they have basically all been purged. And there's now regular purity tests. So there's this project that comes out of a prominent think tank in DC, a prominent conservative think tank in DC, called Project 2025, where they're basically talking about how they're going to staff up a new Trump administration. And one of the questions that they're asking on the application forms is, do you believe the election was stolen? So if you don't believe the election was stolen, you're actually being cleansed out of the party. Now, the question that a lot of people ask, or the insistence that a lot of people have in the United States, is that for all of Trump's charisma and for all of his bloviating, he's actually what would the word be? Administrative buffoon. And he doesn't understand the system. He doesn't understand, how the political system works, how to actually use the levels of power to his advantage. And people say that there are other people in his movements who do understand how the levels of power work and will use them. I'm skeptical of that so that was always the concern, right? In this campaign season, you had a whole group of people kind of people on the left who said that it would be better to have Trump than Ron DeSantis, for example, because DeSantis was going to be the one who's going to be able to really weaponize the government in advance of these ideologies. I just think Trump is so charismatic that you can't defeat him while he's on the stage. And I also think he's so kind of insular that I don't know who he passes the torch to other than his family, frankly. And when that happens, I don't know what happens to the movement, because the sons are certainly not as charismatic as he is. So that might be, the death of the movement, and something comes up afterwards. The Republican Party, is better understood, I think, these days as the MAGA movement. That is, MAGA is the defining movement on that side of the aisle.
It's really interesting because, what was unleashed in the United States with Trump, and also questioning mainstream media and trying to move the way in which we did a study on the Nordic resistance movement and the alternative right, and particularly the alternative right, when they were big, etc., was using humor, memes, etc., to really make the unacceptable acceptable. So to move gradually the way in which you talk about unacceptable ways in which you address particular minorities, etc. And this has been a process which is happening in a lot of different countries, and not the least the United States. To what extent, because we see these sort of right-wing populist movements having different intellectual origins in the United States. You mentioned the Turner Diaries, etc., but also sort of the rich tapestry of intellectuals that have right-wing intellectuals there. You have in France, you have in Russia, you have others who have converged given social media, etc. Given, we know Charlottesville, but given the US is such a large continent and so influential, what about the international connections and connectivity between other groups to these forces?
Yeah.
Do you see them? I know that we've talked about this before. We know, for example, one of the favorite groups for the neo-Nazi Nordic resistance movement is the Patriot Front in the United States. But are there other forces in relation to right-wing movements in Europe or elsewhere that you see connects to the US scene?
Yeah, I think so. You have to break the answer down into inspiration and then coordination. So inspiration is certainly flowing back and forth quite smoothly, quite happily. When you trace that trajectory of violence that I explained earlier, I mean, it's bouncing across oceans constantly. And some of these manifestos that associate these attacks can get very strange in the way they talk about the US. So Brenton Tarrant, who conducted the Christchurch shooting of 2019, he writes in his manifesto that he has this section of his manifesto where he says, I could have used explosives, but I used firearms because I wanted to have an impact on Second Amendment debates in the United States. So that's kind of, it's really hard to know how you approach that from the US context. There was another incident that happened, I think it was October 2022 in Bratislava, a shooting at an LGBTQ plus bar, basically, Teplaren bar in Bratislava, Slovakia. English language manifesto, because of course he's appealing to this broader network. And in there, he has this section where, it's a fascinating section of his manifesto where he writes about abortion rights in the US. And he says, the striking down of Roe versus Wade in the US is nothing but a token victory for white people because they're still importing more immigrants than they're having children. So ideological inspiration is flowing both ways. I think that second part that you talk about with Patriot Front and Nordic resistance movement is the tactical coordination. I think that's been a little bit slower. I do believe there were Americans involved in the Brazil election riot, coordinating with the Brazilian movement. The most interesting case that we've had in the US, I have to say, is the case of a neo-Nazi group called the Base. Because the Base is it's a cell-based neo-Nazi terrorist organization in the US, multiple arrests, multiple plots, Georgia, Maryland, those kind of places. But the leader of that group is a former Special Operations Command, and I think DHS, Department of Homeland Security, employee, so a former US government employee who's currently based in St. Petersburg in Russia. And all the media reporting and all the court documents that have been published in relation to this case have always left it kind of unclear whether he's, protected by the Russian government there or if he's employed by the Russian government there. So that's that tactical coordination side that I think is still growing. That might be the next development here, right? Is, of course, groups like the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, they have tactically coordinated across borders forever. We'll see if the violent far right is starting to pick up on that too, or if they just decide. I was giving a book talk yesterday at Defense Research Agency where somebody pointed out very astutely, I thought, that isn't lone act of violence a sign of weakness, right? Individuals acting alone as opposed to operating in groups is because the government is so strong that they can't operate in groups. And of course that's right. So maybe they just decided they're going to keep going down this pathway. Coordination, especially across borders, just leaves you vulnerable to those kinds of interdictions. And of course, the Nordic resistance movement is a good example of that because the only white supremacist group that has ever been designated as a terrorist group by the US government is the Russian Imperial Movement. They were designated in the Trump administration as a specially designated global terrorist, so not a full, what we call foreign terrorist organization, but kind of a secondary designation. And part of the reason why they were designated is because of links that they had with the Nordic resistance movements, because of the training they were doing. So maybe that's what leaves you vulnerable to government infiltration.
Yeah, they were doing training in partisan special operations training centers in St. Petersburg and other places. But they were not solely the only organization. There were other, the Dritte Weg, etc. There were also training there. I'm going to open up for any questions you have. And if you, unless you have a very burning desire to be anonymous, please just say your name and also please State your question. We have running microphones here for those who...
Okay, so I'm Edwin Lofthammar. I study military history at the master's program, and I'm really interested in American gun culture specifically. And you mentioned the Brady Act, but I was thinking about the 1986 machine gun registry closure, as well as the 1994 assault weapons ban. And I was wondering what your take on how they sort of, the 86 closure made a full auto sear for an AR-15 worth 64 times its amount, amount worth in gold. And then with the assault weapons ban, kind of took away the ability to buy those guns, and then they came back in 2004. Do you think that sort of artificial scarcity set the stage for a sort of deification of the AR-15 as the people's rifle and the militarism of the gun movement in America?
Do you want to take that one?
No, you're the expert here.
Very good question. Wow, very tactical. You're too in-depth for me, I'm afraid. Excellent. Yeah, I think that's perfectly possible. I mean, the AR-15 and, firearms they are part of the law. And it's really important to note that whenever individuals in the movement talk about government tyranny, which they talk about all the time, usually guns is the first step. So it's like guns, when the government comes for your guns, that's the first sign, that's the first volley of government tyranny. So it's completely woven in. So those kind of bills, yes, whether that's the intention or not, they're taken to mean the government's coming for the guns. My understanding is that the most important kind of the legal process that's happened around guns that you might be interested in checking out is a 2008 Supreme Court case called Heller versus the District of Columbia, which is when the Supreme Court basically enshrined Second Amendment rights. Ever since then, there's been really no pushback, and again, that hysteria arises that the government is coming to take our guns away. And this is something that we battled with in our book. I mean, our gun control recommendations in our book are pretty kind of around the edges of this problem, because if you ever were to actually push for full gun control, you would have a massive violent reaction. You just would. And so that's the kind of battle we're facing. So what can we do about particularly violent, particularly potent firearms like the AR-15, right, which is almost always the firearm that's involved in these cases, both ideological and non-ideological gun violence, mass gun violence. Can you do something about ammunition control? So often with these cases, they involve individuals who have acquired firearms legally and then acquired massive amounts of ammunition very, very quickly. So it's not like people who've built up arsenals. It's like somebody who goes and buys 1,000 rounds. So can you slow that process down and make people have to buy it more incrementally? Can you look at background checks, red flag laws? There's something happening in the United States which you might, if you read a lot of American gun news, you will notice it, I think. People have moved away from using the term gun control almost completely, and they're now using a different term, which is gun safety. And it's all about, we've finally realized we're not going to get at the gun issue, so how can we dance around that and try and have people store firearms more responsibly, all of this stuff. I mean, this is also a big conversation that my co-author and I had, because he's pro Second Amendment. I am actually a survivor of gun violence myself. So we don't agree, even us two, on that. It is, I think, one of the definitional questions. And I would just say, in Europe, in my opinion, the number one counterterrorism measure that they have in European countries is firearms control, arms control. And so from a counterterrorism standpoint, in the US context, we're almost starting from a losing position. That's the reality that we are facing. And we have learned time and time again that that's not going to change. Great question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please.
Hello? Hi, Carl Åkerström. You mentioned individual and sort of the connection with Russia and the question there, but one of the main persons of interest around January 6th and also quite involved in QAnon is Michael Flynn. I remember during the Senate hearings on January 6th, I was very taken when he was asked, do you support the peaceful transition of powers, and he pled the fifth. And how sort of, on the higher level, because he was a general, well, how much is that on the higher level? Because you keep hearing, you know, Marine Scout snipers with SS flags and all that, but how is the higher tier of US military, how infiltrated would you say that they are by these movements?
So Michael Flynn, for those of you who don't know, is a retired 3-star military general. He was director of our Defense Intelligence Agency, and he was Trump's first national security advisor for a few days before he got booted out for links to some government, Turkey, something like that, Turkey. He's now a full-on QAnon supporter and Christian nationalist, so he's kind of gone off the deep end. The military issue is radioactive in the US. We've spoken about it a lot, my co-author and I, and people get really upset. So it's hard to do research on that kind of question about how high up the infiltration goes. My experience is, from what I've seen, you have certain, the military is not overrun with extremists. It's overrun. There are, people who are quite right, and it's largely a right-wing leaning, organization. But for the most part, you don't see extremists. The areas where you do see disproportionate number of extremists is veterans. So of the 200, I think, people involved on January 6th who had military background, like 97% were veterans as opposed to active duty. Army, you see more in the enlisted side than officers. You see more so people who are like rank and file as opposed to senior, and you see more in special operations. So frankly, again, my experience, I have not found that the senior levels of the military are overrun with extremists like Michael Flynn, who certainly is an extremist and certainly is post-democracy. Tends to be lower level grunt, what we call grunt infantry workers in the US context, where we've seen extremists make inroads. It's been a very controversial issue in the US, frankly, and after January 6th, the Biden administration came in and tried to implement this kind of reform. We have our first black Secretary of Defense. He is somebody who's dealt with these issues in the past. And the number one thing they did was they tried to implement a stand down, which was basically over the course of 60 days, every unit in the military was going to stand down to talk about extremism. And it was very unpopular. It was kind of farcical. In fact, everybody I spoke to said, we spoke for like half an hour about don't be an extremist, and that was it. Nobody actually learned anything. I suspect that one of the reasons it was farcical is because actually the military itself isn't, in fact, overrun with extremists. And in large part, you are seeing people in the veteran community who have disassociated from the military. Maybe they fought in combat. Maybe they've been injured. Maybe they have untreated trauma. Maybe they come from areas of the country where levels of racism are higher. Maybe they're not being welcomed back into their communities as they thought they would given their service. And maybe they feel they've lost a brotherhood. And all of those things are driving them to find another brotherhood that can appeal to their ego, appeal to their lens of the world as kind of being us versus them. That's where we've seen a real issue. I hope, although let me clarify that with one thing. I have made that point quite a lot in the past 6 months on our book talk, and multiple times, I've had somebody come up to me afterwards and say to me, hi, I have a military background, and that thing that you said about it's only a problem among veterans and not active duty, that's not true. So, maybe this is my optimistic side. and people have pushed back on me for that. But that's what our experience has been on our research. I hope that answers your question.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. Ladies first.
Hi. Well, first of all, thank you for a very interesting lecture and discussion. My name is Irja, and I'm a PhD student here at the Swedish Defence University. And my own research is on AI, social values, and security. So I was very intrigued by your talk on polarization and social media. So my question to you is perhaps a little bit more philosophical, because I do think we start to come to a certain point where it becomes impossible to trust information that we see, because we might get very different news feeds depending on personal data on the internet and things like that. So do you think that we are reaching a point of a post-truth society, and what does that do for democracy in the future, do you think?
Yes, I think we probably are. I mean, I would argue, perhaps I'm not sure I would make this argument in the US, but I would argue that we have a political party in the United States that is both post-truth and post-democracy. So I would argue that we're not necessarily moving that direction. It's actually already here. Our media landscape, let alone social media, our media landscape is completely divided. So when if something has happened in the world, let's take an example like, anything in the Gaza war, for example. You can go to somewhere like the Washington Post website, right? Traditionally left-leaning outlet. You can go to Fox News website, traditionally right-leaning, and you will find two completely different stories, two completely different narratives. So if you, off the bat, are going in different directions with your narratives, what's it going to look like, 2 months down the line, 4 months down the line, 6 months down the line? So yes, we are living in these very divided spaces where you have pockets of post-truth, people who no longer value those things, and that leads itself to post-democracy. I mean, we used to have a standard, I think, in American democracy that things like peaceful transitions of power, non-violence at voting booths were non-negotiable. They were sacrosanct. That's no longer true. That's that post-democracy side, I think. One of the really frightening things, I think, one of the really difficult things in our book was, I didn't realize this till afterwards. So if you have an opportunity to read our recommendations section of our book, you will find a number of recommendations in there about pushing back on these things. Months after we published the book, I kind of had this realization that our recommendations are quite arrogant, because largely they make the argument that, if you just give people education, if you just give them grace, maybe you have to give them mental health programming, they will see a better path. They will see the truth. They'll reinvest in democracy. They'll reinvest in truth. What if that's not true, right? What if people do want the anger, do want the division, and they are kind of just wrapped up in that, and they're happy in that? That's almost a much bigger issue that I think is much more societal, much more strategic level. Fortunately, I live in the counterterrorism world, so I can just kind of stop and let somebody else handle that. You, hopefully. I think absolutely we're in a post-truth space, and that's one of the things I tell my students is one of the challenges that we're facing with extremism, especially in the US, is often you're dealing with people who just have a fundamentally different truth than you do. It's not necessarily that they're horrible people. I mean, they are because they conduct violent acts, but their reality is different. They have a different reality than you do on things like immigration, right? So the good part of me said, the idealist in me says, we have to bring them that mental health programming or whatever. We have to bring them those resources, but maybe even that's not good enough. So I don't know. On social media, just real quick, because I think that's an interesting one. So in the US, we have something called Section 230. Section 230 is part of the 1996 Communications Decency Act, which basically says that social media companies are not publishers. That's the language. They're not publishers, which means they are not personally liable for content on their platforms, which means they can't be sued. And so the EU, for example, has just passed a new Online Safety Act, I think last year or whatever, where Facebook, Twitter, Telegram, all these platforms, many of them American platforms, are now facing like massive fines in the European Union for content. We don't have that in the US at all, right? They're protected. But on all our travels, and Bruce and I have spoken actually a lot to people on Capitol Hill, on both sides of the aisle, this is the one recommendation that we make in our book, striking down Section 230, where you do see bipartisan support. So you're going to see a serious, I think, pushback imminently in the US on the freedoms that social media companies have. The reasons why that's important as well is it's not just counterterrorism or counter-extremism, it's also state disinformation, it's online child sexual abuse material, it's body image disorders, it's the whole gamut of online harms that everybody just kind of can tell now has gotten out of hand. And so there is going to be a pushback imminently in the US, I believe.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Last question up there. Up there? Sorry, all the way up there.
My name is Anna, and I'm studying military history, a bachelor's degree here. I have a question about the situation in Germany, where there have been several court decisions for the security services to more or less look after the party AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, and the situation there, and also the discussion about more or less there are some people who want to ban the party, and how that may increase the threat, or if it could have some positive effects on the threat levels and so on.
It's a great question. This is a fundamental difference that we have in the US. I'm actually going to point to another scholar's work on this because it's a lot better than I can articulate it. A prominent German terrorism scholar called Peter Neumann wrote a piece, I think in 2013, I think it was called The Trouble with Radicalization, which you can look up. And he basically wrote that in Europe and in Anglo-Saxon countries, so he said that's the term he used for like Britain and the US, they have different understandings of radicalization and therefore what to do about it. So they said in Europe, they see radicalization as something that's cognitive. In the US, it's behavioral. So in Europe, European governments can get quite nervous and therefore push back against what's known as cognitive radicalization, right? The radicalization of ideas. In the US, because of our First Amendment, which protects freedom of speech, you can't police cognitive radicalization. You police behavioral radicalization. So somebody being an extremist is not illegal in the US, right? Somebody being a neo-Nazi is protected by the Constitution. You have to be a criminal neo-Nazi, and even then you're going to face charges for your criminality, not for your ideology. So it's completely different systems. Now, you know, I'm European as well as American, so my view personally on it is I think the German government gets very nervous about those kind of movements because frankly, and European governments police cognitive radicalizations because frankly, they have personal historical experiences with what happens when dangerous ideas are allowed to circulate in a population and you don't do something about it. We don't have that mindset in the US at all, partly because things are protected by the First Amendment. And so one of the things that, my co-author and I, as we've been kind of traveling around speaking, one of the things that people get really worried about when we talk about is standards on social media, things like domestic terrorism legislation, because people say, speech is protected by the First Amendment. You can never infringe on speech. And my answer, to get very constitutionally nerdy about the US Constitution, our Constitution's First Amendment protects freedom of speech, but it also protects freedom of religion. And if you allow Nazis, not necessarily saying the AfD is Nazi, but if you allow Nazis to be public, you are creating an environment where other people's freedom of religion is being violated. So that's a First Amendment violation in the other direction. So generally speaking, I am relatively accepting of kind of crackdowns on movements. The bigger question, I still think it's one of the fundamental questions of the terrorism studies field. Magnus might have thoughts on this, but for example, in the social media space, people have studied the concept of deplatforming, which is the idea of taking certain movements off certain platforms, just kicking them out. And people have studied that question at length, and I've seen very convincing arguments, data-based arguments on both sides, either that deplatforming works to make groups go away, or that it doesn't work because those people will A, get more committed, and B, they'll find another area, another place to mobilize. So I just think, the question you're asking is a great one, but it is kind of foundational to our field. And if we find an answer to that, the solutions will get a lot easier. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Jacob, for enriching us with your knowledge. And I can highly recommend the book. We'll get one copy for the library, I think.
Yes.
And also, we don't want you to leave here empty-handed. We like branding here at the Swedish Defence University. So we thought we would brand you with a hoodie here with the Defence University logo as a present going back. And I know you have roots here as well, so it's delighted. You're always welcome to come back here. And so you have a home here.
Thank you so much.
So thank you for coming. And please join me in thanking Jacob.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the social media and the web.
Thank you so much.